So, welcome to this most wonderful edition of ENGR 315-A. This is one of the last few that we will have. Believe that we have four more classes, including this one. My plan was to reserve the last day of class, being Wednesday, April 29th, as a review day. Any questions that you have, we could go over. If you had questions that you wanted to go over, you can also just get in touch with me anytime. That always holds. So don't be afraid to reach out. But there were a couple last things that we were going to go over yet. So, but before we get into them, any questions?
Mother Marius.
Nick Serban.
Now, are we done officially with homeworks then?
I was probably going to throw one last one out there, but yeah, that's be it.
Okay.
Probably one more.
Okay, that's okay. Because I'm just wondering, because our isn't finals like coming up like not next week, but the end of next week. Then we have finals starting.
April 29th is the last day of classes, and then finals follow. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah,
right.
It's called the last homework assignment would be due the last day of classes.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Cool. All right. So, here we go. So, we've been talking about a bunch of different things. Gone through bending, stress. We've gone through bending, stress distributions, shear stress distributions, deflections, thermal expansion, constrained systems, unconstrained systems. We've gone through a good amount of material. Today we're going to try to throw it at something, and then find something else. Also sound. So thin wall pressure vessels, pressure vessels. So pressure vessel. The definition of a pressure vessel is pretty straightforward. This is an excellent example in the slides right here. It's a vessel that holds pressure, either inside or outside. So in this case, you got a bunch of pressurized tanks. So they're holding something inside of them. You can think of it like the propane tank for your house. It's pressurized. And it's holding a pressure difference between what's inside of it and what's outside of it, right? What's outside is like atmospheric pressure. What's inside is significantly above atmospheric pressure. Just for kicks and giggles, how else could we think of this? What's another example of a pressure vessel?
Another pressure vessel?
Yeah.
I mean, if they're like propane tanks or gas tanks or whatever, I guess any pressurized. So, I mean, propane tanks. Yeah, would airplanes be one?
Correct. Yeah, Coach Call because is when they're flying around 35,000 feet, the air pressure inside the cabin is what you'd find at 8,000 feet. So the fuselage of the aircraft is maintaining a pressure difference between what's inside of it and what's outside of it. Exactly. Same thing with like a submarine. It's maintaining the pressure difference between what's inside of it and what's outside of it. What about a space? So what about a space station?
Probably.
Yeah, because you're maintaining the pressure difference, right? Pressure outside's pretty much nothing. Pressure inside's 1 atmosphere. So we go. So the analysis that we're going to be doing is equally applicable to all 4 of those situations. So just keep that in mind as we move through it. if you wanted to apply it to any one of these, you could. You just have to figure out what the pressure difference is that the tank is holding or protecting from. Okay, that's really kind of the $1,000,000 question. Speaking of that, though, so say that I have let's go back to the propane tank. So like these guys is here on this slide. Imagine that they're all pressurized to some high value. And the question of the day is, if these puppies were going to break, how would they break? What are the ways that they could fail?
Valves could burst.
Okay, so they could rust and fail like that. But let's think about it in terms of if there's no this way, if there's a failure purely due to the stress caused by the pressure that they're holding in. So if I just crank up the pressure in those things, how's it going to break? I just keep ramping up the pressure until something blows. What could break and how could this fail? There's not one answer to this.
If there's like an imperfection somewhere in the metal, it's gonna break there.
Okay, so if there's an imperfection, we know the imperfections cause stress concentrations. But what could be an imperfection besides like a dent or like a scratch? Like what else could be an imperfection?
Like if it's thinner in one area due to like how it was made.
Okay, good. What about like you see these stands coming off the top, or like you have these lines coming off the bottom? To put those in, if that goes into the tank, what do you have to do to the wall of the tank?
Cut the tank.
Say again, Nick?
You have to cut it.
Yeah, so there's a hole where this goes through. Is that going to cause a stress concentration?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another point of failure. What else could happen? Assume how else could this thing blow up? I just keep ramping the pressure up. Assume that I have a perfect tank. There are no imperfections. There are no holes in it.
The lines could break.
There are, okay. Hey, just think of the tank, though.
Valves, I don't know.
Okay, so you have this tube now. There's nothing connected to it. The first that comes to mind, honestly, is so you have these ends on it, right? What if the ends just shoot off, right? Like that is a way that it could fail. It could blow out an end. Or like the middle of this could start to develop a crack and the two ends come off. That's another way it could fail. Or like or say a seam along this top could open up and it could start blowing upwards. So with those different things in mind, let's kind of look at what an FEA model says, and then we're going to start to like drill down into an analysis of this. Good though. So if we looked at a finite element analysis of this, this is a computational stress model. It looks like a lot of our first thoughts are right. So like where we have things attached to it, where we have holes through the tank, the stress goes to some higher value. Like you have this red around where things are connected. Okay, great. So we got so that means that our intuition is correct. Interestingly enough, we also see some concentrations around the ends, which is probably where the ends are welded on, and where there's a sudden change in shape, right? We know from doing stress concentrations that rapid change in shape are bad. They usually end up in higher stress concentrations than they otherwise should. So that's good. But let's dig into this a little bit more. You remember back when we first talked about stress concentrations, it was what? A rectangular beam, and we put a hole into the center of the beam, right? And then we yanked on both, both ends. Okay. So what was the stress around that hole like? Was it high really close to the hole? Was it high on this side of the hole, this side of the hole? Was it high up here? What did stress look like going through here?
It was high around the hole.
Okay. So if I look over here, there's some like average amount of stress. Woo! Over here, like some average amount of stress. Woo! And then right next to the hole, on this side, Nick, or this side?
At the top.
At the top. Okay. So even right up until the hole, we have some more or less average stress. But on the top, and because it's symmetric, the bottom of the hole itself, we had some really, really increased amount of stress right at the top and bottom of the hole, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does this look like that at all? You can kind of see some red up there and got some red down here. So you have an increase in stress at the top and bottom of a hole. Does that look familiar at all? Because if it does, then that means that this tube is in tension, right? It's essentially like this bar. You have some tension on it. You have a hole sitting in the middle of it that's causing these stress concentrations right at the top and bottom of the hole. So this kind of gives us some intuition as to what's happening here. So we not only have some gas in here that's at some high pressure and the tank's holding it in, but as a result of trying to hold it in, the tank is in tension. It's being pulled. It's being stretched It's being stretched lengthwise at the very least. We might also think that it should be stretched the other way, but because the effect is the same the whole way around, the pressure is just pushing straight out on all sides, we don't see that kind of lateral stretching. We only see the longitudinal stretching. So as we go into our analysis, we're going to have to kind of think from that kind of point of view. Make sense? Any questions on that? All right. So let's get it on. So I'm going to change my webcam over to the document camera. And let's get it on. All right, there we go. So, all right, so we just said for our pressure vessel, little thought experiment. Just said that there's some longitudinal stretching going on. because we could see that stress concentration around the hole there. So we know it's being stretched. So if I was to draw a little pressure vessel here, there's my side view of it. We know that the pressure on the inside is going like that. So I'm going to have to figure out what that's doing. There was no evident lateral deformation or stress. You have the more or less the same thing. And we said, at least I was saying that might be because if I look down the barrel, pressure is kind of uniformly distributed. It's pushing out in all directions. So it's not like it's stretching any one way more than another. So we're not really thinking about it becoming a egg or whatever. It's just going to stretch a little bit in all directions simultaneously. So you might think that's probably going to be a pretty small effect. But like the big question is, okay, so like what stresses get induced trying to do this, right? So like if I'm trying to stretch the entire thing outward, so that means that the radius is going to change, right? If the radius changes, the circumference changes. So it's like a change in radius. It's kind of like because I get fat, I suddenly have to buy larger pants, right? Because I've grown in circumference, right? So change in radius, it's a change in circumference. So that means that just write the full word. I'm not going to abbreviate that. Yeah. So if our circumference has changed, that's as if I wrapped a piece of string around here, and then I had to stretch the string a bit, right? So that means that the surface of the pressure vessel, the skin of the pressure vessel, or PV, is actually stretching in the circumferential direction. So if I was to look at kind of a section of it, so that's a section of the pressure vessel skin. If I was to look at that, I'd see it stretching a little bit in order to as the whole vessel got bigger. Y'all following me here? Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So if the skin is stretching,
Brother Morris, I have a question.
yeah.
What's the X over the arrow for? Was that a mistake?
Nope, it's saying that this does not do that. Remember, it said like because the pressure is equal in all directions, it's not going to stretch into an egg. It's going to just become a bigger circle.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
So if the skin itself is changing in length, that means that like we can think of it from just like a Hooke's law kind of point of view, right? There's just a change in length. There's a stress normal to it because it has to be it's essentially just being pulled in order to be larger, because also wouldn't want to stretch in that direction, right? So we're going to end up with some normal stress due to the internal pressure just pushing out in all directions. By the same token, we can kind of look at this guy up here. I have pressure pushing this way. I have pressure pushing this way. The thing that's stopping it is the fact that I have a piece of metal going from end to end, right? This is almost classically normal stress, right? It's just a sheet of metal in tension. You have I'll have my two ends. I'm pulling on the two ends really, really hard, or the pressure's pushing out on both ends. And you have this sheet of metal that's holding it from just flying apart. So it's just like a bar in tension, except now it's a tank. Y'all follow me there? That says bar in tension, skin of tank sees normal stress. So, have we mentioned anything about shear stress here?
No.
No. Right, as of right now, we've kind of looked at all of what pressure does inside of this tank. There are no shear stresses that we've picked out. Keep in mind that we're also ignoring all like ports, welds, holes, whatever. This is just a cylindrical tank with spherical ends on it. Okay. Cool. So these are the two stresses that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to be going from here. A couple of assumptions before we get too far, though. One, we are going to be looking at thin wall pressure vessels. What is that? What the heck does that mean, right? Means that if I look at my pressure vessel, this is like a side view looking down the length of it. The vessel will have some wall thickness T and some radius R. A thin wall vessel, the ratio R over T is typically greater than 10. So the radius of the vessel is over 10 times the thickness of the wall. So the walls are thin. As a result, we also assume that because the walls are so thin, the walls cannot support any bending loads. So we're going to ignore bending. We're assuming that their second moment of area is very small. Okay. We're also going, something else that we're going to do. Mentioned a whole bunch of stress concentrations before. We're going to ignore stress concentrations for just like starting out here. So that means that we're going to assume axial symmetry. So nothing changes in the geometry of the tank as you go as you rotate it around an axis. The internal pressure is uniform. And no end effects. So on the finite element model that I showed before, there were some different stresses at the ends of the pressure vessel. We're going to ignore them. We're going to assume that there are no large differences in stress due to changes in geometry or anything. That goes along with this axisymmetric thing, uniform internal pressure, all that sort of deal. Now, yes, this is like not entirely, how do I say this? Like this does have some limitations. Like obviously you need to put a port into these things in order to get stuff out of them or put things into them. But let's start out with these assumptions and see if we can at least get a baseline going. Maybe we'll talk about stress concentrations later on. So let's get it on. Does Devin have these written down? Do I need to keep this up here?
I got it. I don't know if everyone else does, but
Oh, no one else is talking. So here we go. So let's make it happen. If we look at our pressure vessel, I'm going to attempt to draw it in 3D. I usually suck at this. Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's a cylinder, I promise, with a ball on the end. Okay, so that's our pressure vessel. It has some internal pressure. We also have some external pressure, right? So let's say that the external pressure is 1 atmosphere. Let's say that the internal pressure, let's say that that is also 1 atmosphere. Just for kicks and giggles, is there any stress in this pressure vessel? Any stress here?
No.
No. Why?
Well, there's no like net load.
Right, exactly. There's no pressure difference. So what's inside isn't trying to get out. What's outside is not trying to get in. Therefore, there's no load here when the internal and external pressures are the same. You're absolutely right. So one thing that we're going to use to when we look at pressure in these is something called gauge pressure. So how I've written these, they are absolute pressures. So that's like a PSI A, where the A is absolute pressures. That's measured relative to a vacuum. So if I had something that was 0 psi, it would be a vacuum. There'd be nothing in there. What we're going to look at instead is gauge pressure, or if I was in psi, it would be psig. In metric, I don't think that they have these abbreviations that they tack on. You just gotta specify it. So this is gauge pressure. So in this case, so for this particular example, if I was to restate my internal pressure, the gauge internal pressure would be 0. Because what gauge pressure does is that it records a pressure difference between whatever vessel you're measuring the pressure in. So between a sensed volume, so like inside of the vessel, and the ambient pressure, so what's outside of the vessel. So whenever we work these problems, we're always going to be working in gauge pressure, not absolute pressure, okay? So any pressure I say from here on out is going to be gauge. I'm going to try to note it, but just keep that in mind, because also our summation of forces don't work out and stuff. All right. So let's crank things up a bit, change our internal pressure. This means that I'm going to just ignore this and say that my gauge, I have some gauge pressure, and I'm going to call it 4 atmospheres, all right? So now now my pressure vessel is under stress. Is stressing it because I have some pressure on the inside, different from what's on the outside. In this case, it's trying to get out. Okay, so that means that the I just wrote gauge there. Sorry if it was too small. So that's a gauge pressure of 4 atmospheres. So the surface of this vessel is under stress. Remember, it's just a big tank filled with the pressurized gas in this case. So how do we find internal loads? What's our favorite way of doing this? And if it's not our favorite way, how do we do it?
Cut a section.
Woo! Yeah, now we're talking. So we're gonna take a section. Doesn't matter where we take a section. No, because pressure's the same everywhere. So all our loads should be symmetrical. So let's take a section here. So kind of see what I'm doing there? I'm just chopping this tank in half, literally. So let's look at my section, still kind of in an isometric view. It looks something like that. And if I have some fluid in here that's under pressure. This is a great time if any of you like the band Queen. So look up the song Under Pressure. It's a hit. Anyhow, so we have stuff in the middle that's under pressure. We have this metal here that's going to have some force in there, right? So if I was to draw some loads here, if I was to finish out my free body diagram, what might I have? If we start with the metal, yeah.
Would it be like a distributed load?
Yep, you're right. It would call it absolutely would be a distributed load. It's called the pressure in particular. We know is distributed because it's a pressure, right? Ow! Just bent my cheek. Ow! But let's start with the metal. We kind of know intuitively that the skin of this tank is in tension. So I can start drawing kind of some arrows there. So there's some force. It's distributed along the outside of the tank, and it's in tension. We also know that on the fluid, if we think of like the other half here, it was pressing. If I think of the fluid like on this end of the tank, it's going to be pressing this way, right? It's going to be pressing on the fluid up here, right? So we're going to have a bunch of force going into the tank, going wherever the fluid is. Essentially, wherever the metal is, it's in tension. Wherever the fluid is, it's being pushed the other way. And that's creating that tensile stress. Okay? So if I was to look at the force here that's in the wall, that's like a normal force, right? It's created by a normal stress. So how do I relate a normal force and a normal stress?
Hooke's law.
Okay. Hooke's law, sweet. So how do I relate a normal force and a normal stress? Where's force?
Young's modulus.
That's just how stiff the material is. Where's my force? Is it wrapped up inside of this? Is it wrapped up inside of this guy somewhere?
Yeah, that's force over the cross section area.
Right. You have a normal force. You can relate it to a normal stress if you can find out the cross-sectional area that force is acting on. Even when we talked about bending stress, it was like a differential area, the differential force. Well, this is convenient because everything's uniform, so we can just find the cross-sectional area and we can get a force. So if I can get my area, I just say sigma A, and I get my and I get the longitudinal force that is in my metal. By the same token, how do I get a force out of this internal pressure thing? How do I find out how much force this pressure is creating? How do I get force from the pressure?
Force, pressure over area.
You got it. Except force over area is pressure. But yeah.
Force over area.
So I can say P internal times an area equals force of, say, the fluid. And these areas naturally are going to be different. This is like the internal area, which is what the pressure is acting on. It's pressing on itself, you might say. And the stress is acting on like the metal. It's acting on the hull of the pressure vessel. And those are the only forces in our free body diagram, right? Like there's nothing else here that we could stick a force on. So if I do a summation of forces in this longitudinal direction, it's just what? And you say like that way is the positive direction. It's just F longitudinal minus F fluid is 0. That's our entire summation. That's our entire summation of forces there. Done. So if I can find what these areas are, and I know how much pressure I've cranked into this tank, I can figure out what the longitudinal stress is, which is awesome. So let's see. So let's see if we can bang that out.
Good morning. What does that say? F longitudinal equals F longe minus F fluid?
So this is the summation of forces in the longitudinal direction.
Okay.
So if I look here, that's my longitudinal force due to the stress. That's F long, and then the only other force I have is this pressure force that's acting on the fluid. That's what those are.
Okay, thank you. It's like for some reason blurry. Like I don't know, on my end it's pretty blurry, so it's kind of hard to see what they say.
Okay, I'll try to write larger.
Okay.
Thanks.
I just want to make sure I was writing down the correct stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me know. All right. So we just need to figure out some areas. So the two things we know are the wall thickness and the radius. So if I need to find, or the inner radius. So if I need to find the radius of the area of this blue section, that's pretty straightforward, right? If I know the radius, then internal is just pi times the radius squared, and we're done. Cool. For the area of the metal, that one's going to be a little bit more interesting. If we wanted to be complete about it, we'd say something like, what? Pi radius plus the thickness squared minus pi r squared, right? Where T is the wall thickness of the tank. However, we don't have to be as intense because we assumed a thin wall. We assume that the difference between these two is small. So conveniently, we don't have to worry. We can simplify this a little bit. So here we go. Let's slide this up. So if I have a rectangle In order to get its area, I need to know that dimension, and I need to know that dimension, right? And I'm gonna get my area of a rectangle. Woo! Well, what if I took that rectangle and I wrapped it into a circle? Yeah, maybe I'd still need width and length in order to figure out the area, but it just happens to be wrapped in a circle. Does this really work? Not really if you have a large thickness T, but we don't. We have a small thickness T. So so what I'm saying is that if I have a thin wall vessel, which would be like this, right? That'd be like the wall of my pressure vessel. If T is small, then I don't need to go to the extremes of finding what my outer radius and my inner radius are. I don't need to do that. All I need is the length of my strip, or we might say the circumference, or 2 pi r, where r again is the inner radius, and my width be t. That's like the A metal that we talked about before, the area of the metal that's resisting the longitudinal stress. We're all on the same page? Sounds gives a sense. All right, so if I go back to my summation of forces here. So said summation of force in the longitudinal direction is F long minus F fluid. That equals 0. Said F long, that's the stress in the longitudinal direction times a metal, the cross-sectional area of the metal. That's minus the internal pressure times the kind of internal area, or the area of the fluid that the pressure is pushing on. So if I substitute in my areas that I just found, be like 2 pi RT minus P internal pi R squared equals 0. So the longitudinal stress on my pressure vessel, therefore, the internal R over 2 times T. That's our expression for longitudinal stress in a thin-walled pressure vessel. The internal times R divided by 2 times T. And that's about where we're going to pause for today. Are there any questions?
Nope.
All right. Any other questions?
Thanks, Brother Marius.
Welcome. All right. Well, that's all I got for today. I'll see you all on Wednesday. Remember, if you would like to take advantage of the half credit back offer on the test, it has to be in on Wednesday. I believe I said by the end of the day. I will have a Dropbox on Canvas for you to dump them in. All right.
Thank you, Morris. Thank you.
Welcome. See you around.
See ya.